Welcome, Bill. Thank you for joining us. We
Thanks
much
for having me.
appreciate it.
Oh, uh,
Let's just crack on, shall we? We're going to have a little chat about some of the things that we've both been experiencing over the last however long, and that kind of leads us into the first area is what your perception is of how things have changed in relation to steroids over the last however long. And that in itself, however, how far do we go is an interesting question.
yeah, sure. I mean, I would say there's been a slow, steady shift in patterns of usage, right? Going back to when I was first getting interested and involved with this, area of work and research, it was more isolated, not completely, but it was more isolated. And we're going back into, pre-2000. Back to the 90s. I don't want to date myself too much, but going back to the early 90s, it was more focused on bodybuilding and athletic use, and it was starting to make its way more into the mainstream, but it still seemed like it was a long way off for that aspect of it. And since it's been slow and steady, and now you have so many more people using these drugs that are outside of athletic use, outside of bodybuilding use, or I should say outside of competitive bodybuilding use, and it's more of an aesthetics thing. They want to look and feel better, which I think it was a natural progression for these drugs. They're attractive for that purpose. So we've seen the usage expand. And at the same time, over that same rough time period, we've seen the supply chains shift dramatically, to where, decades ago, these were mainly pharmaceutical products that were diverted. There was some counterfeiting at the time, but that's what it largely was, pharmaceuticals, counterfeit versions of pharmaceuticals. And now we have a lot less of those two categories, because it doesn't make, the buying focus isn't anymore on pharmaceutical products. Most of the steroids, whether you're in the UK, I'm sure the United States, it's underground products, raw materials that are smuggled in and converted into usable products. So we've had this tremendous shift and acceptance of these underground laboratories, while at the same time pharmaceuticals are becoming less and less, prominent in the marketplace, which disincentivizes counterfeiting of the pharmaceutical products. Not that I'm saying there aren't counterfeits out there, but now the business model seems to be a lot more straightforward. Get raw materials, create your own lab, put them on the black market. So those two shifts are a little bit concerning to me, because I think you have less and less focus on research before people are using these compounds, more casual use of the drugs, but the supply chain has been degraded quite a lot with these underground products. Sterility is a big concern nowadays. Contamination, what you're actually using. I have a company called Colorimetrics, which makes these roid test kits to do reagent-based analysis of products. So we've been following this for since 2015 when we launched, and even in that time, we see less and less of the more expensive compounds, like say your Anavar is a key one that's counterfeited quite a lot, Primabol and stuff like that, which are much more expensive from raw materials side. They are less prominent in the marketplace now. Those are much more often to be counterfeited with low doses of testosterone and stuff. So you have again big supply issues, and often people aren't even sure what they're using nowadays. So
I mean, absolutely, you raised a few interesting points there. I want to just go back to the point about timescales. When do you think the tipping point was where actually more people were using, for want of a better word, recreational or image type use, when it moved from bodybuilding, when it really moved into the mainstream? How far back do we need to go in America and in other places?
I'm just giving you my estimate. I don't know that there was one watershed moment, right? Like this happened like we had in like the '88 Olympics, right, where steroids suddenly became a focus in mainstream media. I don't think there was a moment like that, but sometime around 2000, give or take, I started seeing a lot more people that didn't fit that previous category of competitive bodybuilder, athlete, what have you. So sometime around there, I think we would see a shift in the demographics. But I'd be curious. Rick Collins has done some study on the demographics before, and I believe he's working on one again. So I'd be curious to see, how that's continuing to change as well.
I mean, I think that's fairly similar for here in the UK. I mean, we might have been a little bit behind, maybe 2005, 2007 type sort of area, but absolutely. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was the change from pharma to UGs to underground labs, and
Sure.
And all of that's brought with it, because back in the earlier days, underground labs were a dirty word. Nobody wanted to go to an underground; they were horrific. But actually now, some of them, the quality is pretty good, but like you were saying, the untested and the difference in quality is a massive issue.
Sure. I mean, I've seen both. I've been invited to tour laboratories that have that are underground, but they're produced in licensed facilities, often in Asia, where the producers were proud to show off how their products were being made, how they were securing their raw materials, how their product was, and indeed it should be in that kind of facility, sterile, accurately produced. I've seen home brewers that took a serious focus on quality and sterility. And in one case, I had to get dressed up in a bodysuit and wear all this protective gear before I walked into what would loosely be defined as a clean room in somebody's house with positive airflow, and everything was filtered. It was quite impressive to see that, but at the same time, you don't need that to make the end product. So it's they run the gamut. You have a lot of product that's just the production itself introduces bacteria into it, and that's leading to a lot of additional issues. So you do see both, but certainly there are underground products now that are very high quality, and also the market accepts that now. For a long time, I also used to blame prohibition, whether it's criminal penalties on use like we have here, possession, or just prohibition on the supply, diversion from pharmaceutical sources. I used to blame that a lot and say that we need to reinvestigate that, and I do contend that we do need to look at that again, but you can't discount economics, how that's playing in here. I don't think, even if you roll back some of the laws, if you went back to the U.S. back in 1988, in the 80s, where it was criminal but not heavily prosecuted and the penalties were light if you diverted stuff, and that was allowing a lot of it to take place. I don't think if you even went back to that type of a regulatory environment, if it would change, because it's so much more profitable to get raw materials now. And with China, which is the main market for raw materials, being so open and competitive, it just doesn't make sense to pay $50 for a bottle of something diverted from a pharmacy when you can make it for 7 or 10 or 5 on your own. So
absolutely, yeah.
So that's the market, that's what the black market is, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Ali, so during this time frame of change that we've observed with all the different drugs and all, have you seen a different way in which they are used? Is there we've often had the discussion over here, but between the difference between use and abuse, and are steroids, the more and more it's becoming apparent that there are many dependency markers for the steroid users. Do you see anything similar over there, or?
Well, what I've personally seen, and I tend to think, or maybe it's just me being an old person trying to blame the internet or the new technology, but I've seen the patterns of use get, use and abuses can be defined a lot of different ways. So I don't want to split hairs on that, but usage that's clearly much more abusive is more normalized nowadays. And I've attributed it to people being more open about what they're doing, more bragging when they're using a high dose, and oh, this guy's using a gram a week of test. I'm going to use a gram and a half, and it's just become normalized, these very high doses. Whereas I have people coming to me saying, I'm looking at doing my first cycle. Can you give me your thoughts? This is what I was recommended. It's 2 grams of testosterone, 400 milligrams of trenbolone, and I'm going to take some anadrol or some D-bol with it. And I'm like, no, I would not recommend this. And I personally would absolutely not do this, especially for somebody first trying anabolic steroids. Just take testosterone alone, at 100 milligrams of testosterone a week. For most people, that's a performance enhancing dose. It's more than your body's going to produce. And you get to like 200 milligrams, 400 milligrams. That's a formidable amount, especially for somebody that's never used anabolic steroids before. Now, not trying to recommend a cycle for anybody, but if it were me and I had the knowledge that I have now and it were my first cycle, that's what I would be doing, 200, 400 milligrams and see how that works for 8 weeks. But people today are so much more aggressive when getting into it. And they get recommendations so widely to do this kind of thing. Oh, you want to be big like this person? Well, this is what I think they do. And that concerns me a lot because, they're definitely pushing themselves into a range where side effects are going to be much more prominent and safety is going to be a greater concern, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, so side effects you mentioned there, what are the main worries for the future use, for the future health implications for our steroid users, and in particular our long-term steroid users?
Yeah, for me, it's about cardiovascular, right? A lot of the side effects that they talk about with anabolic steroids are transient or cosmetic, right? Like gynecomastia, female breast tissue development. That's not really, although maybe some implications of small incidence of breast cancer in men, maybe or maybe not linked to to testosterone excess, but that's a separate issue. So you have a lot of the stuff that we talk about, cosmetics, bloating, acne, stuff like that. That's not really affecting your health in of itself. The changes to the cardiovascular system, especially if you're going to be a long-term user, are definitely concerning for me. They shift cholesterol in an unfavorable direction with your HDL, LDL. Your blood pressure can go up. Your hematocrit can increase, which thickens your blood. The endothelial lining in your vascular system can become a little stiffer, less flexible, which increases risk of cardiovascular incident. So you have a lot of things that shift in regards to all these cardiovascular markers. And then, in the short term, they're very unlikely to be an issue. That's one of the things about steroids that's kind of, on the one hand, the acute short-term safety is very high of these drugs, which leads people into often a false sense of security. It's the long-term impact of changing these markers that I'm concerned about. And you're starting to see it in some of the data, but it can be hard to tease this out, and we need a lot more study in this area. But you are starting to see that people with a long history of anabolic steroid abuse are more likely to die at a younger age, have cardiovascular issues. And so that's what I'm always trying to drum onto people. When when they think about gyno or water retention and stuff, these are things that they may be able to just tweak with other ancillary drugs that they're using to mitigate these side effects. But the impact on the cardiovascular system is something you really can't escape with these drugs. It happens at fairly low, performance enhancing doses, and it happens very quickly. One of the things I like to talk about in my lectures is there's a study with injectable stanozolol or Winstrol, where they took a single 50 milligram injection, one injection, and they looked at the change in cholesterol a month later. And those that had taken the drug had a substantial impact still a month later from one injection. So, this is something you really can't get away from. There's supplements you could take that can help mitigate it. There's things you could do with your diet that can help mitigate it. Cardio can help mitigate it. But pretty much no matter what you're doing in that those aspects, it may help, but it's not going to reverse that risk factor. So
do you think we've seen any additional or different risk factors in the current climate, and How has COVID affected all of our users, and if they are still using, are they using more? Are they using less? Well, what do you see in America?
I can't speak to how much in general people are using, but my one data point is the sales that we have from Colorimetrics, which sells the test kits. When COVID first hit, we were actually worried as a company because the first month, or around March, when it was really hitting in the media and everything, sales were really quiet. Like everything stopped, and we have other businesses too. It's like everything seemed to be affected. So we were concerned about all aspects of the businesses that we have. But since then, after starting April, it was a steady climb back, and I believe it depends on how things close out with the year, but I believe we may be on pace to have a record year this year with sales. So I think at first people were concerned about spending money. Maybe they weren't spending on cycles. Maybe they weren't spending on the testing. I can't tell you for sure. After, I think people, when there's times of crisis, they do say that people focus on themselves when they can. It's one thing they can control, right? So people putting in their home gyms, figuring out other arrangements to train, focusing on their bodies when other things are more chaotic. So I don't think COVID has had any dramatic reduction in the use of steroids here. If anything, I would probably wager that use may be up a little.
I guess I can echo that for over here. We've many areas that have seen an increase in people training at home, like you say, and you've only got to go on eBay and see how much free weights were costing 3 months ago, up to £5 a kilo instead of £1.50. It's absolutely nuts.
Yeah, we've got the same here, home gym equipment. There's a couple things I wanted to get, and I'm just like, we'll wait. But thankfully, I had some equipment before that I've been dragging around from place to place over the years. So basic functioning stuff here, yeah.
So what do we think's around the corner? What's next? We've had lots of predictions historically about SARMs and things. What can we expect to see next?
I'm curious if we're going to see expansion with SARMs in the actual pharmaceutical space. I think that may be coming. The data on these compounds is promising, at least in the aspect of dealing with prostate issues. That is a concern with testosterone supplementation, which, again, that whole aspect of abuse aside, I think testosterone supplementation in older men that are noticing a decline can be a very important, healthful thing. But with there's this concern about excess androgenic activity. These SARMs, some of these really seem to address that. And it did seem that there were a couple on track. So I think that field, whether it's true pharmaceutical products or continuing in research and on the underground, but I think you're going to see more with SARMs. Side note on that, they still have a lot of the same side effects as steroids. They affect your cholesterol. They can increase your liver enzymes. They're not completely devoid of the same side effects. They work by the same receptors. But they're at least promising. I think you're going to see more with that. Now with peptides, it's now not a problem to synthesize, all these different proteins. We can identify a new protein. We can synthesize it within cells. So you're going to see more expansion on that. The understanding of muscle growth is expanding. It always expands every year. I do work with arachidonic acid, and a couple of aspects of that, which really weren't talked about before, is that it can increase ribosome biogenesis in your muscle cells, that's the site that the proteins are assembled within the cells. So we find that this is another rate limiting factor in muscle growth, how many ribosome sites you have in your expanding muscle cells. And if it gets to a point where there's not enough, it becomes also inefficient. So maybe we'll see drugs that expand ribosome biogenesis. Another aspect in my work over there is leukocytosis, which is an immune system response, which helps clear damaged cells in your muscles. And also it can instill a little bit of damage to the tissues themselves. So that's an anabolic reaction that we're seeing. We may see some drugs go in there. there's so much open to the future with these drugs. It really comes down to what, how much more we can learn about how muscle growth is facilitated in the body and how we can tweak that. Myostatin inhibitors, we haven't seen a tremendous, there's been more, I think, speculation and profiteering in that area than actual true, progress, but I think that's coming. I think you're going to see stuff there. So more and more, I think the research areas, and with access to all these peptide manufacturing, we don't have to wait for a drug company to develop something to have access to it. So as the research progresses, the underground chemists, the labs, the online sellers are going to get access to them, and people will do some experimentation on themselves. So I think you're going to see more and more expansion in new drugs. Whether or not they'll ever replace anabolic steroids, that remains to be seen. I don't know.